Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tatiana Show. I can't believe that even though things are as busy as they are, I'm still able to bring you a show this week. I'm sorry I haven't been that great about making so many shows lately, but there's quite a lot going on, which you can find out about on TatianaRose.com and also on CryptoMediaHub.com. We've rebranded everything, but you can always go through some of the old shows. Today, I'm really happy to have Scott Horton from the Scott Horton Show and from Antiwar.com back onto the Tatiana Show. So thank you, Scott, very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you as always, Tatiana.
Excellent. So just so people know, Scott has been covering wars for a long time. He's probably my most knowledgeable friend and guest to talk about this. So when I recently heard about what was going on with Palestine and Israel, I thought back to a previous conversation where we had discussed it. And, you know, I have a lot of friends that have different views about it, but I think that you're probably the most knowledgeable about that situation. So I thought it'd be a good time to maybe unpack that a little bit. I know that there's quite a lot of history. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you and get Scott's take.
Okay. Well, I guess I want to start with just challenging and dispelling sort of the common talking points. I saw this in my Twitter feed yesterday well, Israel has the right to defend themselves from rockets. But that's the logical fallacy of begging the question. And, people always say begging the question when they mean raising the question. But begging the question is when you're essentially smuggling your conclusion into your question. So, of course, everyone has the right to defend themselves. When you put it like that, what you're doing is you're presuming that that is, in fact, what is going on, and that the Israelis are the ones who are defending themselves. But you see, when you phrase it that way, you never have to prove that. You can just pretend that when Israel commits acts of violence, that is a retaliation and a reprisal. And when a Palestinian commits an act of violence, that is always aggression. They are always the ones who started it, and the Israelis are always the defenders. And it's never even discussed. It's never even shown. It's just built in with a bunch of fake semantics, right? And so Israel has the right to defend themselves from rockets. Do you ever hear anyone say the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves with rockets? Don't they? Well, don't the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? You don't ever hear anybody say that, because that's a mark of a dishonest argument, and the Palestinians don't need dishonest arguments, Tatiana. It's the Israelis who are completely full of shit, all the way up to their eyebrows. They're the ones who have to cite a 2,000, 3,000-year-old religious book in order to claim they have the right to violate other people's rights. And they're the ones who have to figure out how to pretend that with their F-16s and JDAM satellite-guided bombs, that they are the defenders. And the Indians that they have herded into a little concentration camp reservation are the aggressors against them. But it's just a line of crap. That's all it is. And the reason there's a couple reasons it's partly confusing. In American history, at least up until World War II, the population was pretty anti-Semitic. It wasn't really until our grandfathers helped to end the Holocaust that then that became, in World War II, that became a real badge of honor. It's something that the American people are really proud of, that Jews are this tiny persecuted minority, and we saved them, the Europeans, well, some of them, the ones that didn't die in the thing. But in American history, Jews are, they're not... They haven't historically been as economically disadvantaged as blacks, but they've been essentially a picked-on minority. In fact, when I was in high school in the mid-1990s, was the last privately owned country club in Texas where Jews were not allowed. Was actually what happened was Jews bought it from the bankrupt old WASPs and said, well, we're allowed in now, aren't we? But that was in the 90s, right? That kind of discrimination against Jews is part of their history, even in America. Now, there's never been a major anti-Jewish pogrom in America or anything like that. Nothing like in Europe. But kind of anti-Jewish sentiment has been, part of our history, right? And so then it's kind of odd and confusing when the story of Israel Palestine is that the Israeli Jews there are the white supremacists. At least the, 30 or 40%. I'm sorry, I forget the numbers. It was somewhere between 20 and 40% are Ashkenazi Jews from Europe. And they are the ruling caste. And it's true that there are a lot of Middle Eastern Jews that live there as well, because it's a muddled issue. It's not as easy as just race. But they are essentially discriminating against the Palestinian Muslim and Christian, actually now majority, or at least, equal number of people. And so it sounds odd that what we think of typically as a persecuted minority, in this case, they are the overlords. And it is the Palestinians who are the ones who have been screwed from the very beginning. And that's just the reality. Now, people think of it like, well, they're whiter. They're Westerners. Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, until this weekend, let's cross our fingers, it could still fall apart, but he's, apparently is going to be thrown out this weekend, and we're going to get back to what role that has in the violence here in a minute. But Benjamin Netanyahu, he speaks, essentially American English. He doesn't have a very thick Israeli accent or anything like that. And they seem like they're part of the West. The Germans, the French, the British, the Spaniards, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, we're the West, right? And they're part of that with us. So now to look at it from the other side's point of view sounds crazy, right? On the other side is not the West at all. On the other side is the East. On the other side is the hordes of Muslim barbarian orcs who are coming to try to destroy the poor little, Minas Tirith, our little outpost, our eastern forward western fort out there. And so it seems like a pretty big ask to say, well, wait a minute, look at it from the orcs' point of view. Okay? But they're not orcs. That's all a bunch of crap. And frankly, the Israelis aren't Westerners. The ruling caste, the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the ruling caste in Israel, are mostly from Poland and Russia and from, Eastern Europe, not Western Europe. Now, some of them are from Western Europe, but there's a lot of Easternness to their ruling regime, such as, for example, their avowed ethno-state. That they just passed a law even last year that says this is the nation state for the Jews. And here's something that you don't have in the United States of America, Tatiana, or pretty much anywhere else in the world, is the 20% minority of Israeli citizens inside what they call Israel proper, who have Israeli citizenship. They're still treated like second-class citizens and all, but they have citizenship. But that's not what counts. What counts is nationality. And only Israeli Jews have Israeli Jewish nationality, and that's what makes them the two legs better of the equal there, to cite Animal Farm. And so this is not an American tradition. Rabbi Kahane told Mike Wallace back in the 1970s, we don't believe in all this Thomas Jefferson stuff, all this stuff about everybody is born equal and free. We don't believe that. It's our tribe versus everybody else. We win, they lose. And we don't care if what we have to do is wrong. Wrong has nothing to do with it. That's Rabbi Khan explained that on 60 Minutes. And that is essentially the ruling philosophy of the Israeli state. And so, I should have asked you at the beginning, Tatiana, if you have a screen in front of you, to go to Google Images and pull up a map of Israel real quick and just take a look at it. And I'll ask your audience to do that. And I don't mean to be too patronizing here. I am presuming that most people don't know much about that. But that's not an insult to you or your audience. That's all Americans really don't know the story of who is occupying who and who is zooming who. In fact, my friend Grant did a poll. And most Americans, or a plurality at least, I forget if it was a majority, believe that it's the Palestinians who are occupying the Israelis, right? Because TV will never tell you the story. They'll never show you who's who. Okay, go ahead.
Can I ask you something? So I watch some weird stuff, and I'm always trying to understand what went on with Israel. And certain things seem to indicate that Israel was okay, regular school. They're like, oh, the Holocaust happened. All the Jews were sad. We had to put them there because otherwise everybody's going to kill them. And that's why they're in Israel. But there seem to have been a lot of other efforts to establish a Jewish presence in Israel more strongly, even before the war.
Right.
Do you know anything about that? Because apparently it was even banking related. Like there was something in Basel in Switzerland, and they sort of planned it. But I don't understand that history that well. And also sometimes you just get some weird ass history, right?
Right.
So what is that? Because I think it's a really great thing, right? Okay.
Well, you're exactly
Israel
right.
can say. Right, but Israel can say, oh, look, we got beat up, and nobody can ever criticize them ever again, and all of a sudden it's about being Jewish and not about being a Zionist or a statist, right? And so they really muddle the issue.
Right.
Can you help me understand that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, Zionism came out of the 19th century when, the 19th century, the 1800s, when, get my head straight here, when, there were nationalist movements sweeping all across Europe, these kind of ethno-nationalist movements. And Jews were very persecuted in Russia and in Eastern Europe. They had, you're familiar with the term pogrom, which is when, the Tsar would just send people out on riots against Jewish communities in Russia and in Eastern Europe. There's, a terrible history of anti-Semitism there. And so the founders of Zionism decided, well, we should have our own state, and we should have a Jewish, a European Jewish ethno-state. They were essentially all Yiddish speakers, and they, from Germany to Poland to Hungary and into Russia and Belarus and wherever all Jews lived in Eastern Europe. And they said, we ought to have our own state. And at first, one of the original ideas was, let's go to Palestine. But Ben-Gurion, and even before him, I guess, they had sent scouts ahead and said, well, there's people there. What are we going to do? There's a bunch of people there, so we can't do that. So for a while they had a plan, we'll go to Ethiopia, or we'll go to Madagascar, a large island off of southeastern Africa. Or there had just been a massive ethnic cleansing campaign against Indians in Argentina. They said, maybe we'll go to Argentina. There's a land without people because somebody else just killed off all the Indians. And they're like being invited there. So, okay, well, maybe we'll go to Argentina. So the project, these were essentially mostly secular, atheist Marxist types. They were not bound by biblical duty to return to the promised land and all of that stuff. That's all, according to the mythology, that's supposed to wait for the Messiah before all the Jews go home to Palestine and all that kind of thing. So as I think some of the
That's why some Jewish people get mad and they're like, these guys are not okay because the Messiah hasn't come, so we're not doing this correctly. Is that right?
Right, yeah, and they joked about that who made Ben-Gurion the Messiah, right? This, he's not. He's just a politician. And then, yes, so in America, now the people you describe now, the religious Jews who object to Zionism, are a much smaller number, but they are a very determined number, and they call themselves the true Torah Jews and this kind of thing. They have a big presence in New York, and they are avowedly anti-Zionist for religious reasons. But that was the dominant strain in Europe and in America until after the Second World War. And in fact, the Reform Jews also rejected Zionism in America, also rejected Zionism. But then after the Second World War, it was like, hey, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and also the terrorist groups, Jewish terrorist groups in Palestine, the Errand and the Haganah and these other groups committed vast terrorist attacks against the local population, but also against the British occupying force who had ruled the place since World War I. And
why? Why were they just like causing trouble all of a sudden? Because they were mad.
Well, of course, everything is Woodrow Wilson's fault, right? So part of the results of World War I was America helped Britain and France, and Russia for that matter, but they were out actually by the end, but helped British and France completely destroy the Central Powers. And that meant they obliterated the Ottoman Empire, Lawrence of Arabia and all that. It's the British encouraging all the Arabs to rise up and overthrow Turkish imperial rule. And we promise we'll give you independence at the end. But of course, that was a lie. And the French took Lebanon and Syria, and the British took the rest. All of Iraq and Jordan and Palestine and down into Saudi Arabia and Egypt and all the rest became dominated by the British. And then
time out. So isn't this when there were a lot of kind of like warring tribes and stuff taking over that area, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure in terms of government.
Yeah, it was all, it had been the Ottoman Empire, which had then been destroyed. And so, yeah, there's, a huge power vacuum there. And essentially the Arabs had no organized force really to protect themselves from British
Were they
power.
better off
Right.
under the Arabs? I mean, under the Ottomans, I guess. I don't know what the Turks.
Oh, well, it depends on who's they. I mean, we're talking about power factions here. So, yes, lots of Arabs benefited from the end of Turkish rule, but then they also got the shaft from the British. So, it's part of being a small, weak country stuck between major powers, which is, a huge part of the story of our time as well. But so the British made for themselves what they called the mandate, right? Like someone had handed it to them, their mandate in Palestine. And after World War II, Israeli Jewish terrorist factions started mercilessly attacking them. They bombed the King David Hotel, and there were a bunch of other attacks too. And the British finally said, fine, we're out of here. And at that point, and they make so much of this, the Zionists make so much of this, but it's such BS, okay? The United Nations General Assembly, which has no authority to create a new nation state on the planet whatsoever, recommended a partition of the former British mandate in Palestine. They had no authority to recommend it, and I think they kicked it to the UN Security Council, which didn't vote on it. But what they suggested was completely crazy. It was a map that divided the place, a lot closer to 50-50 than it is now, but in a crazy patchwork that could have never worked. And this was at a time where Jews owned about 3% of the land. And the Palestinians were being told, you're going to have to split it with them about 50-50, which meant giving up all this land that they had no reason to give up, and that the Israeli or the European Jews who were coming had no right whatsoever to claim.
That would make me so mad.
Yeah, exactly. It would make anybody so mad, and that's why they lied for decades. They pretended, and you may have heard this phrase, well, it was a land without people for a people without land. And the Israelis, boy, they just needed someplace to go. And luckily, Tatiana, even though the entire Bible history and all of everything you've learned about ancient history and medieval history and modern history, of course, there's a population on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Are you kidding me? What do you mean there's nobody there? It's the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. It's the crossroads of 3 continents. It's the epicenter of all of this trouble. You're telling me there's nobody there? That's where Jerusalem is, for Christ's sake, right? And Jaffa and the rest of these cities. So, but they just lied, and they pretended that was a crazy conspiracy theory, that there were people there. And what happened was they were armed by the Americans, and the Palestinians had been disarmed by the British. And I guess they were armed by the British too, the Zionists were. And so they were ruthlessly attacking the Palestinians and ethnically cleansing them from their land. Now, the story you'll hear in school or wherever is, they were just trying to create a nice little country for themselves on this land without people when the merciless, evil Arab invaders attacked them. Well, but that's completely crazy. They were in the middle of what's called the Nakba, the catastrophe, where they cleansed 750,000 people from their villages, from their homes, and herded them into refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere in the Middle East. And so this is equivalent to the population of Austin, Texas. Imagine a forced march of the population of Austin, Texas, out of the city, fighting where the people of Austin flee and then they're never allowed to come home again. This kind of thing.
Yeah,
totally
I saw
against
some
the Geneva
of these
Conventions and all of the international law that the U.S. has created for the world. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I saw exactly that. Like a lot of Palestinians just being chased from their homes, being slaughtered, like children, the whole thing. And
yep. Raped and
again,
lined
like
up and shot.
Yeah, I don't understand why people are hearing these stories and thinking that the Israelis are the victims. Like so far, I don't think that they're the victims. But anyway, please continue.
Sure. Well, look, a big part of this was as anti-Semitic as the Americans had so recently been, the Jews are whiter. And the Arabs, they're browner. And I can't understand a word they're saying. And they believe in this religion that even though it's an Abrahamic religion, it's part of the same tradition as Judaism and Christianity, just, with another prophet after that. Nope, it's totally alien. It's more alien than Hinduism for some reason. And these people are just, and that's no slight against the Hindus, but I'm just saying they're from further away, and they're not from that same monotheist tradition whatsoever, right? But they act like these people, the Arabs, are their sand N-words, right? Like that's the term form that Americans use. Towel heads and camel jockeys, and they're N-words. They don't count. And so even though at the end of World War II, it's really the end of the age of colonialism, and by, in 4 years, the British would have to give up India and give up Southern Africa, and the empires, America really inherited the empires and turned it into this kind of pseudo CIA coup d'etat empire rather than outright colonialism. But colonialism was over, but here's one last gasp for it. Okay? We're going to create this one last gasp of this European-centered population on Middle Eastern territory. And so they had started this massive ethnic cleansing campaign in 47 and into 48. And then the neighboring countries attacked: Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And sorry, I forget if there was one more involved at the time or not. But the Israelis won. And part of the way that they won the war was they cut a secret deal with the king of Jordan. And the king of Jordan wanted to keep the West Bank of the Jordan River. So if you had Googled up a picture of Israel now, you should see this, what looks like a big chunk taken out of Israel, right? Like the Arabs invaded and stole this big piece of what was Israel before. But that's not it. That's what's left of Palestine that the Israelis haven't completely conquered yet. And I say completely advisedly there because they have conquered it, but just not completely. But at that time, they hadn't. At that time, in 48, they made a secret deal with the Jordanian king that he would keep sovereignty over the West Bank. And then they defeated Syria and Egypt in the war, although the Egyptians retained control over the Gaza Strip. So the Palestinians, remember that recommendation from the UN General Assembly that the Israelis like to cite, that, the UN said, we could have a state and all of this stuff. Well, the UN recommended that the Palestinians get one too, but they never got theirs. They were
also
just
screw
refused.
the UN. Like,
yeah, exactly. What
are they, the lord of the world, and they can create countries?
Right, and in fact, at the time, they didn't pretend that they could, right? At the time, it was just a recommendation because nobody in the world thought that the UN can say that this ethnic group can come and conquer and remove another ethnic group and take their land. Of course, they have no authority whatsoever to do that. It's completely crazy. And but so they made this secret deal with the king of Jordan, and that meant that essentially the Palestinians, it's like a holding pattern, right? We can't take the whole West Bank now, but we prevent the Palestinians from establishing a real sovereignty over it. And then millions of them, I'm not sure the exact, hundreds of thousands of them, went to, were essentially banished to refugee camps in Syria, in Jordan, and in Kuwait. Many of them were kicked out of Kuwait in 1990 when Yasser Arafat sided with Saddam Hussein in the first Iraq War. But they had been living, languishing in a refugee camp in Kuwait, right, which is where they're not from. And anyway, so in 1967 is when the big change. Oh, well, let me go back. So after the War of 48, what the Israelis had accomplished by their massive ethnic cleansing campaign, the Nakba, which again included rapes and massacres and all kinds of war crimes and atrocities to accomplish. And what happened was they had seized what we call now Israel proper, that is minus the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but within what they call the 1967 borders or pre-67 war borders, the Green Line, whatever. And so within that territory, they had created an 80-20 super duper majority Jewish state, and including Middle Eastern Jews who, they did false flag terrorist attacks in Iraq against Iraqi Jews to scare them, and in the name of Islamic extremism, in order to scare them into fleeing to Israel. And they did the same thing in Egypt because there were Jews that lived all across the Middle East. Of course, Jews had lived in Iraq for 3,000 years. And it was Zionists who attacked them in order to get them to flee and go to Israel to build the new country. And
can I just for 1 second, what the effing hell is wrong with all these people that they're so bloodthirsty that they're going around after World War II? It was so bloody and so horrible that they still have it within themselves to go around murdering and killing everybody and pillaging them. Like, who's going along with this? And who are these overlords that are so bloodthirsty? I mean, why are these people just, like, why are the soldiers so obedient? You know, like, Polish people fought back during World War II. Like, we fought really, really hard, like hard as hell. Jewish people, I don't hear stories about them like physically fighting. Now they're like this.
Oh, sure they did. Yeah.
Oh, maybe I didn't hear about that. So then, yeah, because I don't know, like, when did they become so like eager to fight everybody? Why was everybody so bloodthirsty?
Well, it's the cult of statism. The goal was to create a Jewish state and this, collective victory. As I said before, quoting Rabbi Kahane, who at that time his party was deemed fascist and banned by the Israeli Supreme Court. But I think, his sentiment speaks very well for the modern Likud, ruling consensus in Israel for, the past generation, which is, and for this whole time, since 48, essentially, that we don't believe in this Thomas Jefferson stuff. Right? Like if you accept that Palestinians are individual human beings with rights, well, that ruins the whole program. But that's not what it is. It's us versus them. And they are part of them. And so their rights don't mean a damn thing. They want that land, Tatiana, and they don't give a shit. I mean, the reality is there are ruthless people in the world. And in fact, a lot of times people who have the very worst things done to them, apparently in the case of many of the leaders of, the founding of the state of Israel, were people who'd been persecuted in World War II and who then were ready to dish out some of the same against people who had nothing to do with it, right? Against the Palestinians who hadn't perpetrated the Holocaust or had anything to do with it.
It's very Animal Farm, Yeah, it
is.
Just crazy.
Yeah, it is. And so, and specifically on the 4 legs good and 2 legs even better than that, and the changing definitions of what's right and wrong. But, the king of Saudi Arabia had told Franklin Roosevelt, well, what are you giving them Palestine for? Give them the best part of Germany. It's the Germans who did the Holocaust. If anybody's collectively guilty of persecuting the Jewish people and deserve to have their land confiscated, how about the Germans? That would have been at least closer to fair. Of course, there were individual German citizens who had no personal responsibility and no ability to affect change in their country whatsoever, who were just stuck there. But if there's such a thing as a people who need to be ethnically cleansed so that Jews can have a state, especially European ones, it would have been the Germans in the aftermath of World War II. But of course, the Americans and the rest of the Zionist movement had other ideas. They wanted Palestine.
Why did they? Yeah, that's the whole thing. It's like now it's almost being framed as if, Jewish people needed a place, but they were already trying to go there in the first place. So, they were a perfect excuse.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and frankly, like the anti-Zionist Jews of Europe were killed in the Holocaust. The Zionists, most of them, or many of them, had already gone to Palestine. It was a small minority faction. They were there already trying to build a Jewish community there, if not a Jewish state yet, before the Holocaust. But the Jews of Europe who eschewed all that and said, no, we're Poles, we're Germans, we're Russians, we're Hungarians, or whatever. We don't want to go to Palestine. We're from where we're from. They were all murdered by the Germans. Or 6 million of them were, so almost all of them.
That's what's also frustrating is, like, sometimes people say, like, oh, Polish people were anti-Semitic. Maybe they were. But from my grandmother told me, like, everybody was fine. Like, Polacks and the Jews, they were cool. They were living there for a while, maybe, like, a little beef here and there. But, like, she didn't perceive that. And she grew up in that time, I think that different people had different experiences. But it's very confusing because, the foods are very similar. The culture is very similar. Like, everybody was living okay together from what I knew. Maybe not in Russia, but that's why it's confusing to try and even figure out this history and see. Because now I'm beginning to think that there were just a lot of other things in play versus just, oh, we're anti-Semitic, we're just going to kill these people. Like, it was much more, I think, insidious than that. Like, a lot of people benefited from World War II in weird ways. And I'm not sure how that came to pass either. Like, I don't think I'm getting the full version of history. You look at Operation Paperclip, and where they were bringing all of these, Nazi scientists to America and to Russia. And then I was reading that the Nuremberg trials were essentially a show trial, that nobody even got into any trouble. And it seems like a lot of the eugenicist views were even adopted in the United States, like after the fact. So I don't know about all this history. That's why I guess I'm asking questions. Thank you for helping me understand, and the audience, I guess, too.
Sure. Well, I don't think we can redo all of World War II here today and all that.
Sure.
But,
no, I know. But yeah, I'm just interjecting.
Listen, no, you're right, though. There's a lot of double dealing. The Americans were heavily invested in the rise of the Third Reich. And then after it was over, not only did they bring the scientists here, but really the European branch of the CIA was essentially run by former Nazis. Reinhard Gehlen and his men were the ones that the Americans put in charge of anti-Soviet intelligence in Europe, which of course led to disaster after disaster. And so, yeah, it's a really ugly history there. And, honestly, I have not read a ton about this, but I know that in Germany, Jews were a very small part of the population. They were like 2 or 3%. But once the Germans invaded Poland, there were Jews everywhere. And so that was, when the real the German Jews had already been very persecuted and sent to concentration camps as well. But that was when things really, went crazy, was once the Germans started moving east and discovering these giant Jewish populations. Now, what are you going to do with these people? And so then they decided to murder them all. And so, yeah, it's brutal history. But so it makes sense then, right, why people did go along with, well, you know what, maybe they do need their own state in Palestine, something like that. And then so now back to the fact that the Arabs who live there, they just don't count. And it's essentially, like a throwback to what was sort of already by then this obsolete sort of kind of American anti-Semitism. It was the exact same creature, only turned against the Arabs, right? This same kind of just racist sentiment that, and look, like you talk about how mysterious this is. It ain't mysterious. Look at the founding of this continent. And when was the last time you saw an American Indian? You know what I mean? I saw a couple American Indians when I was in Montana giving a speech, and it was like, wow, an Indian. And I have a couple of friends that I grew up with who were, had some Indian blood or whatever, but like a real Indian with long braids and that kind of thing. If you live out west, if you live out in Arizona or something like that, or further out west, you can see some Indians. But there are vast parts of this country where there are no, look, I'm in Texas right now. There are no Indians. The Comanche and the Apache and all of the different tribes and nations that had ruled, Texas for 2,000 and 3,000 years, they're gone, all the way gone. Why? Because they wanted that land. So what we're going to do, we're going to round up a posse, we're going to get our rifles, and we're going to murder all these people till they're all dead, or at least till they flee, and then we'll have our land that we want. It's just human history. That's how it goes. And so the major contradiction here, really, Tatiana, is that America outlawed this after World War II, right? Because in the aftermath of World War I, they had stripped all these territories away from Germany, and then that made the Germans hell-bent on taking it back, which was a big part of the rise of Hitler and the Nazis and the start of the Second War. And so they said, we're not going to strip territories away from conquered nations anymore and move people into them. So they outlawed all that. And also because Hitler's policy was, I'm just going to kill everybody in my way between here and Russia, and I'm going to take all this land for Lebensraum, for breathing space, for the German people to dominate the entire European continent and kill all the Slavs and all the Jews and everybody else in the way. And so they said, we're just not doing that on Earth anymore. And this is really the USA as the world government. I'm not necessarily justifying the means here, but the end you can understand. They said that, look, we're outlawing that. When nations may fight, and one nation may beat another in war, but it's illegal to start a war, and it's illegal for the victor in a war to transfer their population into the territory of the defeated party. From now on, all these lines are essentially permanent, or if they're going to change, they're going to change by negotiation, not war. Or America will attack you, right? This is the world law under the United Nations Charter post-World War II.
Right, but they chopped up a bunch of other people's countries. Like, wasn't that the whole problem, that they had already chopped up a bunch of people's countries? Like, fine, like, they're the ones that decide.
So they're calling time out. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah,
they're calling time out on where the borders are now. But then again, I mean, 60 million people died in World War II. So the idea was, we can't keep having this. You know, the technology of warfare is such now, even without nukes, that you're talking about entire nations absolutely decimated in major power conflict. And so there's got to be a better way. And this was the answer. But they carved out this exception for the Israelis, but not in the law. It's just America will veto any attempt by the rest of the world to make the Israelis obey the law. Mostly, I mean, there is a UN Security Council resolution that demands that the Israelis withdraw from the territories. See, I'm getting ahead of myself. That they conquered in 1967.
Okay, yeah, maybe we should go back in time.
Go back to the timeline there. So,
okay.
But yeah, so this is the problem. Is in 48, they cleansed so much of the land that it became an 80-20 Jewish super duper majority. So they can say we're a Jewish democracy. And even though 20% of the population,
because we killed all of our opposition.
Yeah, or drove them out, right? But 1/5 of the population were Palestinian Muslims and Christians who got citizenship, but essentially treated as second-class citizens. They're discriminated against heavily in terms of housing, and intermarriage is banned and all these things. It's entire villages are Jewish-only villages where Palestinians are not allowed to live. It's a lot like Alabama in say 1940, something like that, for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? But then here's where the real problem comes in, as though that's not bad enough. But because see, here's the point of that. This isn't a value judgment of mine. I'm just reporting to you the fact that they got away with it. The whole world was willing to go along with that. There's now a Jewish state in Palestine. It's called Israel. These are its borders. And the Soviet Union was for it, and America was for it. And the Chinese, I don't know if they had a comment, but they certainly didn't object to it. And all of the European powers went along. That was it. They got away with it. They did it, okay? Like stealing Massachusetts from the Indians, they got away with doing it. But here's the problem. In the war in 1967, which Israel started, and even Menachem Begin admitted that come on, we can lie to the world, but we shouldn't lie to each other and ourselves. We started that war. Yeah, no shit. Well, anyway, so they attacked the Egyptians, and then the Syrians and the Jordanians jumped in, and with American resupply help, the Israelis defeated all of them. The Six-Day War, it's called. It's the same war where they attacked and attempted to sink the USS Liberty, which I'm sure you've heard of before that scandal. So in that war, they took the West Bank from Jordan, and of course from the Palestinians who actually owned it and were from there, right? And as well as all the refugees who'd been herded in there. And then they took the Gaza Strip also from Egypt. Now here's the thing about it. And again, like, I'm not saying I'm for what happened in 48 or whatever, but again, I explained from an objective point of view, it was sustainable. They had created an 80-20 super duper majority Jewish population. But now that they took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they were essentially kidnapping hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, now millions and millions. I don't know what the total was. It was probably more than 1 million there. Now it's about 6 million Palestinians.
Why? Because they own the borders within which they lived, right?
Right, because they couldn't cleanse them all. They couldn't do another Nakba and force march them all from the West Bank. And in fact, they did cleanse another 250,000 people from the West Bank and force them into Syria and whatever. But there's still left so many people behind that now this is what's become completely untenable, okay? Because since 1967, so 54 years, the Israelis have occupied these people under martial law, essentially foreign occupation law, even worse. And that's longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe in their communist tyranny after World War II. which ended in 1990, 91. So, and then the Palestinians essentially have no rights. They're not really slaves because the Israelis don't want them, but they have no rights that the Israelis are bound to respect. And anyone in America, anyone anywhere in the world who can claim Jewish ancestry of any kind has a so-called right to return to land where their ancestors were supposedly from 2,000 years ago, when the Roman exile happened, which never happened and is a mythology, total mythology anyway. Anyone in the world can move to Israel and say, I'm Jewish, and not just move to Israel, but they can move to the occupied territories. They can move to the West Bank, and they'll get an Israeli government check to move to the West Bank and to colonize land, or East Jerusalem, and colonize and steal land from the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, the actual Palestinians who are actually from there, including little old ladies who still have their deed and their house key, are not allowed to return and have no right of return, and are languishing now generations in refugee camps, especially in Syria and in Jordan and in the Gaza Strip, where 80% of the people of the Gaza Strip are refugees. They're not Gazans. They're from the other side of the razor wire fence, what we now call Israel, where their families were cleansed in the campaign of 1948 and, in later efforts. So now they're essentially hemmed in what was like the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. You could compare it to, people say, well, how dare you call Gaza a concentration camp, because that invokes Auschwitz. And that's
all the more reason to invoke it. Does nobody remember their history? Why would they implement that on people?
In Auschwitz, they murdered millions of people.
Right.
In Gaza, they murder thousands with airstrikes. Okay, it's not the same as Auschwitz.
But over the course of all of that time, that's a lot of people.
Here's the thing. Compare it to Roosevelt's internment of the Japanese in America during World War II. Mm-hmm. It's about 100 times worse than that. Mm-hmm. So if Manzanar camp for the Japanese in America is a concentration camp, which it is, well, then Gaza is certainly a concentration camp. It's not a death camp like, Dachau or Auschwitz or the very worst of the Holocaust. But the term concentration camp doesn't come from World War II. The term concentration camp predates World War II. It means concentrating people together, under control, forcing them together, into a camp because of whatever personality traits or human traits that they have. Like, say, for example, not being born Jewish. And since these people weren't being born Jewish, they're herded into this concentration camp. And for people who object to that and say, wait, how can you say that? Well, if they were Jewish, they'd be allowed out, wouldn't they? Yeah, they would. That's why they're there, because they have the wrong religion. That's why they're in this concentration camp. And it's one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and they're under total blockade. They have no airport, no seaport, no right to fish off of their own shore. The Israelis constantly bomb their water and their sewage and their electricity. It would be as though, imagine... Okay, so here's one of the things. We started off with sort of the misnomers about this conflict. People say, this may be a Ben Shapiro line, well, what if the Mexicans started shooting rockets across the border into San Diego or into Texas, right? What would we do? But you see how that's not an apt analogy at all. Mexico is a sovereign nation. And by saying the Mexicans, that means the Mexican government and its army. But the Palestinians are a conquered, occupied people. The analogy would be much closer to an Indian reservation out west. And imagine if Uncle Sam had never begun to leave the Indians alone. And if the persecution of, say, 150 years ago or 100 years ago against, or 110, 120 years ago against the Indians just kept on mercilessly, and we built giant concrete walls, 50-foot concrete walls around the reservations, and bombed them with F-16s and hovered over them with drones, doing airstrikes against them with drones, and targeted assassinations, and just total clampdown. And we never let the Navajo have a moment's peace in their reservation out there in Arizona. And then they started firing some rockets over the wall. That's an entirely different story than an attack by a sovereign nation state. Okay? And that's why they have to lie all the time. And if you listen to pro-Zionists in their arguments, 100% of the time, they will change the subject to some bullshit made-up metaphor and analogy. Well, what if Mexico did this? Okay? Because they can't talk about Israel and Palestine. Because in Israel and Palestine, the Israelis are essentially engaging in a canned hunt, murdering people in a barrel who cannot escape, who are totally captive. It's like, you ever heard of that, a canned hunt? This is when rich white corporate millionaires will go and pay good money to go to an entire chain link fence enclosure with a jaguar or some kind of, unique and dangerous animal. But they can't escape. They're locked in. It's got a chain link ceiling, roof. They can't get out. But the Dick Cheneys of the world like to go in there and pretend that they're hunting and kill a dangerous and wild animal in a canned hunt. That's what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. But then that's why pro-Zionists always have to change the subject to, well, what if one sovereign nation state attacked another sovereign nation state? Well, that's not what we're talking about, is it? Well, the Israelis have the right to defend themselves, but you're just begging the question. They're not defending themselves. They're the occupying power. It's actually, in law, literally, the Palestinians who have the right to defend themselves, not the Israeli nation state at all. Now, get to the recent conflict that brought up this interview. In East Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank, which was, West Jerusalem was taken by the Israelis in 1948. East Jerusalem was conquered by them in 1967, but they didn't cleanse the land completely, not yet. There's still, tens of thousands or maybe more of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And in fact, I'm going to put this off for a second. I want to get back to the ethnic cleansing campaign in East Jerusalem for a second. More important is this. In the H.W. Bush years and Bill Clinton years, they had established what they called the peace process, where they promised they were going to give up a Palestinian state. They would let the Palestinians have the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem as their capital. And they were in the transition to accomplishing that, but it never happened. Now, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister who was behind that and famously shook hands with Arafat on the White House lawn in front of Bill Clinton, he was assassinated by a Benjamin Netanyahu supporter in 1995. Now, it's not really true that he was going to give up a real Palestinian state, but he was going to negotiate on a lot more honest lines than any of his successors, that's for sure. And once he was dead, and that was it. His successor, Shimon Peres, made essentially no effort and immediately lost to Netanyahu, and then it's been nothing but essentially bad guys from the Likud party ever since then. Ehud Barak was labor, but all he did was a hoax, essentially, where he pretended to negotiate, but deliberately gave Arafat an offer he couldn't possibly accept, which would be these tiny little Bantustans, which is that's a phrase that comes from South African apartheid, where the black neighborhoods and counties would be completely divided up into tiny little sections so that they can't work together and, make a real solid community and separated apart and all this. So they gave Arafat an offer he couldn't possibly accept, and then they said, aha, see, every time we try to give the Palestinians a state, they say no. And give me a break. Doesn't that sound like a line of bullshit to you? Yeah, every time I offer Tatiana a nation state of her own, she says no. Yeah. No, she and her conquered, occupied people, the last thing they want is independence. Yeah, right. What a line of crap. How could anybody even believe that in the first place? But anyway, that's the scam. That's the way they do it. They say, oh, see, they have a funny little cliche. And once you memorize the cliche, you don't have to know whether it's true or not. You say the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And then, see, just say that 10 times over, and then it's just true, even though it's total bullshit. See? Oh, the Palestinians, they never miss an opportunity. And if you tell anybody, come on, that's a bunch of... They'll say that to you. They'll say, oh, come on. Every time we try to give them independence, they refuse to accept it. Come on. How could anyone believe that? And by the way, Robert Malley, who now works for Biden, worked for Bill Clinton then. And he wrote a giant thing in the New York Review of Books about how we screwed Arafat. We gave him an offer he couldn't possibly accept, and then when he declined it, we came out with all this propaganda about how it was such a generous offer that he refused, which wasn't true. And that's straight from the horse's mouth from one of the negotiators on the American side. But anyway, that was the ruse. And that went on long past its shelf life. Oh, no, the peace process, an independent Palestinian state. George W. Bush said, yeah, we're going to work on having a Palestinian state. Barack Obama, yeah, we're going to negotiate toward independence and a two-state solution. Come on. It was always a ruse. And by the time of Donald Trump, the ruse was up. Nobody thought that Donald Trump was going to, create an independent Palestinian state. He is absolutely in Sheldon Adelson and the Israelis' pocket. Do whatever they say, and which he did. He, quote unquote, recognized, which he had no right to do or authority to do, the Israeli seizure of the Golan Heights from Syria, which they stole in 1967 and officially annexed in 1981, that no other government on earth recognizes. Everyone else on earth says that's still under international law and under the International Court of Justice and whatever. It's Syrian territory occupied by the Israelis, but Trump recognized their annexation of it. And then he also, I think Bill Clinton promised, W. Bush promised, and Barack Obama promised, but none of them actually moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But Trump did. And that's a huge, important step, because what it means is that America essentially recognizes Israel's claim that all of Jerusalem, it will be eternally the united Jewish Israeli ruled city of Jerusalem, meaning the Palestinians cannot have the eastern half of it to be the capital of their independent state, essentially once and for all canceling the idea that that was ever going to happen. And then Benjamin Netanyahu himself had said repeatedly that all the land west of the Jordan River will remain under Israeli control forever. So when the Palestinians say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they go, oh, that's a call to genocide against the Israeli Jews. Really? Well, Benjamin Netanyahu says from the river to the sea, this is one state. Now, they have not outright de jure annexed the West Bank, but they have de facto annexed it. And there's no pretending anymore that there will be an independent Palestinian state in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, because there's too many hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jewish colonists living all over that land and protected by the IDF. And it essentially would be impossible to undo the illegal colonization of the West Bank that's already transpired. So it is one state. And that's why Human Rights Watch, well, first of all, Bet Salem, which is the most important human rights group in Israel, and then Human Rights Watch, which is the most important human rights group in America and the world pretty much, and which oftentimes, plays into narratives for American interventionism. That is true, especially like in Syria. But in this case, they're not, shilling for American, intervention against Israel or any such thing like that. They are essentially extremely belatedly, finally admitting for their own credibility's sake, essentially, what is no longer deniable, that Israel is an apartheid state, that whether they officially call it that or not, they have annexed the West Bank. Frankly, they annexed all of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip back in 1967. It's been one state since 1967. And then when you put it that way, then that means it's apartheid. Like Alabama in the 40s and 50s, like South Africa in the 1980s, you have half the population call themselves a democracy, while the other half of the population have no rights at all. Now, it gets a little bit screwy with the statistics because, again, you have 1/5 of Israeli citizens inside so-called Israel proper are also Palestinians. So they have more rights than the people of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And in fact, the people of East Jerusalem have another little standard of they're at least citizens of the city of Jerusalem and have some protection from the Israeli government compared to the people of the West Bank and Gaza who have none. And so Human Rights Watch, I urge you to read it. It'll take you 40 minutes to sit and plow through the whole thing. and read the Human Rights Watch report about apartheid in Palestine, and they just leave no question to it. And they explain all the ways that Palestinian citizens of Israel are discriminated against, and then they explain the absolute hellish conditions of the people living under outright occupation in the West Bank, and even worse, under siege in the Gaza Strip. Now, so to get to the current crisis, this goes back to East Jerusalem. There's an ethnic cleansing campaign in East Jerusalem where Israeli Jews are kicking Palestinian Muslims and Christians out of their homes and moving into them. And this is the kind of thing that you don't see this anywhere else in the world right now. And you might have seen this, Tatiana, on Twitter. It was going around, or you could certainly find it, where a Palestinian woman confronts an American from Brooklyn, New York, named Jacob, who, you know, this is the Holocaust survivor who has to move to Israel in order to protect himself from the German and Russian pogroms, right? No, he's from Brooklyn, New York. He's this big fat guy. And the lady is saying to him, Jacob, you can't steal my house. You're stealing my house. And he says, yeah, well, if I don't steal it, someone else will. So it makes no difference. And she says, no one can steal it. Now you wonder, but how does she know his first name, and why is she on a first name basis with this guy? Oh, it turns out the answer is Jacob and his family moved into half of her house back in 2009, put up sheetrock, and just occupied and squatted and stole half of her house. And of course she calls the police, but the police are Israeli Jewish soldiers who say that they can do whatever they want and the Palestinians can't do anything about it at all. So literally imagine a group of anyone coming and saying, just moving into your house, putting up a sheetrock wall and saying half of your house belongs to them now, and then you call the cops and the cops take their side. That's the reality for the people of East Jerusalem. And if you listen to, and you can find this clip on Twitter too, it goes around. It's I think it's the leader of, it's either the mayor of Jerusalem or it's the leader of his party explaining, you see all this land here? We're going to make this all Jewish land. We're going to kick all of these Palestinians out. We're going to take the entire old city, and all of the land that you see before you here will be all Jewish land. We're only just getting started. All of Jerusalem will be an entirely Jewish city, and these people have to go. Simple as that. And they're as frank about it as could be. No code words at all. These people are the wrong color, wrong religion. They've got to beat it. And wrong religion more than color, because, again, there are a lot of Middle Eastern Jews, too, who live there. But so then that's it. It's a sectarian ethnic cleansing campaign of kicking these people out of East Jerusalem. And then what precipitated the recent violence was first of all, there were massive protests against the ethnic cleansing of a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. And then it was the end of Ramadan, and Benjamin Netanyahu, as we alluded to before, he's got his political problems. As of this recording, he is expected to be unelected prime minister and replaced with Naftali Bennett this coming Saturday. And so I don't know if that's really true or not. Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have a way to pull things out in the end. But so far it looks like the coalition against him is holding, and he may finally be out of power. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm crossing my fingers. And Naftali Bennett is also absolutely horrible, but I think he has, fewer connections in America. Is not as powerful an influence in American politics as Benjamin Netanyahu, who frankly is a giant in terms of the amount of, political capital that he brings to bear on the Republican and Democratic parties. But Netanyahu is in this real electoral trouble, and he's in legal trouble too. He could go to prison once he's unelected. He's being prosecuted for all kind of graft and bribery and this kind of thing. And so what he did was he sent the shock troops to go and attack Muslims praying on the last day of Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that, of course, caused a riot, and Palestinians are throwing stones and all this kind of thing. And so then the Israelis start shooting them with rubber bullets and flashbang grenades and smoke bombs and all this kind of thing. And they kept that up over the weekend. And then on Monday, I'm sorry, I forget the exact date here. This would have been at the beginning of May. Right? Yeah. Or is it the beginning of April?
June?
I think it's the beginning of May.
Okay.
It was. So then on Monday, the Monday after that Friday when it started, the riot at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Israeli troops stormed it again and injured 300 people, including women who were there praying, who they shot them with rubber bullets and threw flashbang grenades and smoke bombs at them and all of this stuff. And they're occupying the Al-Aqsa Mosque while they're doing this. Now, this is the thing about the ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem, is right now the Israeli state, which has the power, they keep the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Israeli Jews pray at the Western Wall, but the mosque remains a mosque under Israeli control, but they let the Palestinians pray there and that kind of deal. Well, the fear of the Palestinians is that if they succeed not just in kicking these people out of their homes where they're from and that they own, that they'll lose their home, but they're afraid they're going to lose the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that Jewish Israeli extremists could end up destroying the mosque and trying to rebuild the third temple, like in biblical prophecy, and start sacrificing animals and start World War III. Because, see, that the Al-Aqsa Mosque is where Muhammad supposedly ascended to heaven when he died, which makes it the third most important site in Islam. It's an extremely important temple. This is, formerly Solomon's temple and all this going back. Well, it's been the Al-Aqsa Mosque since, 700 years ago or 600 years ago or something. I guess, 700 and something. And so if the Israelis destroy it, and there have been attempts before that the Israeli police thwarted, but there have been attempts before by Israeli Jewish extremists to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And there are some, including in political power in Israel, who would very much like to see that mosque destroyed and the third temple built in its place. So this is the height of political tension. Think about in Texas, remember the Alamo and how seriously Texans still take that. But what if Jesus had been born at the Alamo, right? Or had been, that was where after 3 days he ascended to heaven in his human form and all of this. Think how seriously we'd take it then. Well, that's how they feel about the Al-Aqsa Mosque and about the threat to it, that the Israeli Jews are going to destroy it and build the third temple in its place. And so that's a huge part of the tension in the background there. But then Hamas on that Monday, so I think it was Monday the 4th or the 5th of May, Hamas said, if you don't withdraw your troops from the Al-Aqsa Mosque by sundown, we're going to start shooting rockets at you. And the Israelis said, well, screw you. And they didn't withdraw. And it was only then that Hamas started firing the rockets. So step one was the ethnic cleansing pogrom in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. And step two was the shock troopers' riot against Palestinian civilians praying at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then step three was Hamas's retaliation with their homemade rockets over the wall. And which, by the way, I asked a Marine Corps a Marine Corps officer that I know and a munitions expert. I said, hey, can you help me and compare the Hezbollah the Hamas rockets being fired from the West Bank, from the Gaza Strip to a Katyusha rocket, which you're familiar with these, Tatiana. Yeah, you are. You don't know you are. But it's when you see a pickup truck with a missile launcher on the back, that's a Katyusha rocket, right? Like it's not that big of a deal. It's, light mobile artillery that you can rig on a regular pickup truck, even like a what we would call like a mini truck or a mid-sized pickup truck, right? That's a Katyusha rocket. You'll see it'll be like a big rectangle and it can shoot like 10 or 20 missiles out of it, something like that, right? Little tubes in there. Okay, so I asked him, how does this compare to that? And he goes, okay, Hamas's very best rockets, the very few that they have of their very highest quality ones that apparently they've been able to smuggle in, are approximately as good, maybe a little bit less powerful than a Katyusha rocket. And that's the best they got. Everything below that is essentially made out of pipe in a garage. These are just not that they're harmless. 10 Israelis were killed, including one child. Sometimes these rockets hit an apartment building and they can, blow the hell out of it and hurt people. But they are essentially firecrackers compared to the Israelis flying over with F-16s and dropping JDAM bombs on these people's houses. There's, 5,000 and 500 and 1,000-pound bombs on the Palestinians. So it's not to justify what Hamas is doing, but it's just, again, to reiterate the reality. How come it's always a rocket attack? Nobody even dares call them a missile. Even the Hawks don't dare call them missiles because they'd be laughed right out of the conversation by the other Hawks. Okay? These are rockets at worst. They're essentially homemade rockets by, again, a beaten, conquered, occupied force. The Hamas is not the government of the Gaza Strip. They're essentially trustees in an Israeli prison. They're the strongest prison gang and a prison that the Israelis have created for the Palestinians there. And then, again, with the lies. That's why they have to say, Hamas started firing rockets, and just essentially buffalo you, right? They won't say, okay, Tatiana, it's true that these rabid Jewish extremists were cleansing East Jerusalem, throwing Palestinians out of their homes and moving into them, throwing their furniture and clothes on the street, treating them like they have no more rights than livestock and moving into their house. And okay, yes, it's true, Tatiana, that Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously for political reasons, in the middle of the fight for his life, sent the shock troops on the last day of Ramadan to start a fight at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And yeah, it's true that Hamas gave them fair warning after 4 days of attacks at Al-Aqsa that you better withdraw now or we'll start firing rockets. But still, those are really bad rockets, Tatiana. They don't ever say that to you, do they? No. They say it all started when Hamas started firing rockets. But you see, that is what's called a damned lie. They have to lie. They have to lie because the Israelis are guilty. The Israelis are the occupiers. They're the colonialists. They are the aggressors. And so the only way they can get you to take their side is by lying to you. And so that's why all you ever hear from Zionists, and I saw this all day yesterday in my Twitter feed, because what about this or that? Because Hamas started firing the rockets. What about Israel can defend itself from rockets? And that's all they know, and that's all they can say is a line of crap. And if they're ever honest, and this has happened to me numerous times. In fact, I bet I could pull up an email. I got one of these the other day. Someone did not like what I said on the Dave Smith Show. And give them enough space in an email, and eventually they'll get to, well, how come the Palestinians can't just all move somewhere else? Why can't they all just go live in Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait? There's all these countries for Muslims. How come we can't just have this one country for Jews? In other words, Palestinians are not individual humans with rights I'm bound to respect in any way. They are part of the Arabs. And maybe we'll just put them all in boxcars and ship them off to the east, huh? Why not? What morality prevents Israeli Jews from getting rid of the Palestinians like they're nothing more than insects, pests for the Israelis to be relieved of? And if you ever engage with a Zionist in an argument and you say, yeah, but this is completely unfair, it's completely illegal, they're the Indians, you guys are the pilgrims coming and persecuting them, then you blame them for resisting it all. You know what they'll say to you? Well, why can't they all just move away? Why can't I just steal all their land? I want to steal it. And how dare they resist? That's what they come up with. Because when you back them into the wall, they've got no other argument except I like stealing. And I consider Palestinians to have the same rights as, a goat. And I think they are part of some collective of Arabs. And so they ought to be perfectly effing happy to go live in the desert in western Iraq and bake to death in the sun. What right do they have to the homes that belong to them if I want to steal them? That's the argument. That's the argument.
All right. So if people don't like anti-Semitism, like this is not doing well for those relationships because
but Israel likes anti-Semitism. Israel loves anti-Semitism.
right, it's horrible though, because like if you would think think this is just Jewish people, but it's not. It's a Zionist. But then it makes people like, if I was Arab, I'd hate the Jews. I'd be like, get these effers out of here. And it's not even the Jewish people. It's just this ruling class.
That's right. But see, it's good for Israel that if what they do drives anti-Semitic sentiment around the world, well, that just makes more Jews want to move to Israel. You don't feel safe in your neighborhood in Brooklyn? Move here. There was the anti-Semitic attack in France where the guy attacked the kosher grocery store and held the hostages and killed them and all that a few years ago. And Benjamin Netanyahu went to France, and he didn't say, we stand in solidarity with the French Jewish people and because we love you. He didn't say that. He says, yeah, that's right. Be afraid. Be very afraid. Move to Israel. Come to Israel. You'll never truly be Frenchmen. You'll never truly be welcomed here. France is for the French, not for Jews like you. Come to Israel. They hate you here. That's what he said. That's what he said. And so, in other words, you could find two categories of people in America or in Europe who consider Jews always to be an alien race and a representative of some foreign globalist power other than the country that they're from. There are two kinds of people who say that: Zionists and Nazis. Right? You grab the average American Jew and say, what's your home country? They'll say, America. What is this, a trick question? They're Americans. Mm-hmm. Just like everybody else who's an American is an American. But Nazis will tell you, no, they're not. They're all part of this tribe. They're all in on it together. And it's all for Israel and not for us. And they'll define that term as broadly as possible. And then who else says the exact same thing? Benjamin Netanyahu claims that he is the prime minister of all Jewish people in the world, and that all Jewish people in the world are Israelis and owe their allegiance to Israel. And it's a bunch of crap. It's a bunch of crap. But it serves Israel because it serves Nazis. You see? The more Nazis there are in America, the more fear of Nazis there are in America, the more American Jews will move to Israel. And then the same thing for in Europe. If the Israelis can exacerbate anti-Semitism with their persecution of the Palestinians, well, that's just a nice side effect for them. A beneficial side effect.
Well, that sucks. That makes it very difficult to have conversations and make a change because, I have like freaking half my friends are Jewish, right? And it's difficult. First of all, I don't really have a horse in the race, right? Like I'm not over there. It's not really my business. But I hear about it and I'm like, this sounds really bad. And then, of course, I care about Palestinian people just like I would care about any people that are being oppressed, right?
Right.
How do we come back from this? Like, where do we go with this? Because I don't know. I mean, I know even like regular Christians, like I guess there's like a subset of Christian people that are super into Israel and then they support Israel really blindly. I mean, are we just all doomed? Like,
no. Here's the thing. Well, two things. First of all, for your Jewish friends who are very pro-Zionist, you might ask them, like you don't have to prejudice the question, just ask them, well, what do you think about the two-state solution? Because in the polls, super majorities of American Jews support the two-state solution. And that's for two reasons. One is because American Jews are liberals. Like by 85, 90%, American Jews are liberals. And that means, and more old school type liberals too. In other words, Martin Luther King, old ACLU liberals, who really believe in civil rights. And so it's just crazy for them, and they know enough about it because they're interested in the story. They know enough about it to understand who's occupying who and for how long and how unfair it all is. But there's another reason too, and this is a more selfish and cynical reason, and that is that they know that regardless of whether anyone cares for the rights of the Palestinians or not, or whether they care for the rights of the Palestinians or not, that essentially the dream was to have a Jewish democracy, not just a Jewish ethno-state. And if the Jewish ethno-state has to be an apartheid state, where fully half the people have no rights and no civil liberties and no participation in the government and live under this essentially a totalitarian foreign military occupation, then they know that that's not tenable. Just like apartheid in Texas and Mississippi and Alabama was untenable, and apartheid in South Africa was untenable, Israel could be, as I said, they got away with having their 80-20 super duper Jewish majority state, their ethnic, Jewish democracy. But with half the population in bondage, that can't last. So in other words, there are people who are Jewish and otherwise, right? You don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. There are Zionists who are very against Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon and their policy of just establishing facts on the ground and colonizing more and more of the West Bank. They really preferred Yitzhak Rabin. They really wanted to give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to be an independent Palestinian state so that they wouldn't have to have them anymore, right? So that they could have their dream of a Jewish ethnic religious democracy that did not have the burden of this alien population being held in captivity with no representation. And so if you want to start there, start there. And even if they disagree with the two-state solution, which it's too late now anyway, but you could start with, why does supermajorities of American Jews support the two-state solution? It's because they know that the status quo is bad for Israel. Not that it's bad for the Palestinians. It's bad for Israel. They've conquered too many, quote, alien people and annexed their land and don't have a reasonable idea of what to do with them all. And so that was why they supported Yitzhak Rabin. Let those people go so that we can have our thing. And what the right-wing Israeli hawks have done is they've essentially loaded the gun and held it to Israel's own head. Because now what's going to happen eventually is it's going to be a majority rule country, and the majority won't be the Israeli Jews. And then it won't be, they could have had their Jewish democracy for another couple of hundred years into the foreseeable future anyway. Now they'll be lucky to make it to, 2050 or even 2040. And by the way, one last thing on that. Jimmy Carter, who was a horrible president, but everyone considers to be a kind and decent man, and certainly no, racist ideologue of any kind, he called it apartheid. He wrote a book called Peace, Not Apartheid, about how the Israelis got to give up the West Bank, which was, by the way, which they signed in the Camp David deal. That, yes, we'll have a two-state solution. We'll start the peace process now, back in 1979, and never lived up to it ever. And then also Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. Both of them, I already mentioned Barak was the prime minister in 2000 when they screwed Yasser Arafat, and Ehud Olmert came between Sharon and Netanyahu. He was the previous prime minister. Both of them have called it apartheid and said, not because they care about the Palestinians, but because they care about Israeli Jews, we have to let these people go, even though it's way too late for that. So they have no answer for that. They've already colonized the West Bank. They would have to remove hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews from the settlements that they've built on the West Bank, which they're not politically willing to do. They're just not. It would probably cause a civil war within Israel if they were to do that. So the ship has sailed on that. So now what is it? What is it? Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert agree that it's apartheid. That's as simple as that.
Oh, man. No wonder people don't like going down this rabbit hole. I don't know. I would say that even, why does Israel need to be there at all? I know that, everybody's going to cry now that I said that, but to me, it just seems like they just randomly picked out a place and said, nope, this is ours now. If I were a Palestinian, I feel like I wouldn't want to give them anything. I'd be like, get all of your people and beat it because this was always ours. We don't owe this to you just because you were here 3,000 years ago. Which,
by the way, though, you should know that is not the Palestinians' position. Okay.
That's
group
interesting.
Fatah, the group Fatah, a.k.a. the PLO, Yasser Arafat's group, they now rule in the West Bank. They recognized Israel in 1988. In 1988. Yasser Arafat said, not just I will recognize Israel when you give me a Palestinian state, but I recognize it right now. You got away with it. All we want is our measly, stinking 22%. of Palestine, what's left? You guys got the 78%. What the hell can we say? Right? That was in 88. And then that was why, of course, the Israelis helped to facilitate the rise of Sheikh Yassin and Hamas, was in order to create a right-wing religious alternative to the PLO, to divide and conquer the Palestinians even further, to prevent Yasser Arafat from convincing the world that the Palestinians recognize Israel so they can have their state now, right? They don't want a partner for peace. They say all the time, we have no partner for peace. It's all terrorists. They want it that way. They don't want a partner for peace. They want that land. They want to steal the West Bank. They don't know what the hell they're going to do with the Palestinians. Maybe one day America will get in a war with Russia over Taiwan, and while nobody's looking, they can push them all into the Jordan River or the Sinai Desert. Or maybe, I don't know what the hell they're going to do, drop a neutron bomb on them? I don't think they have a plan, but they want that land. And so, that was why they created and helped, not created, but very much helped to facilitate the rise of Hamas, was to divide and conquer the Palestinians by creating this right-wing religious alternative to the PLO. And then in 2004, when the leader of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin, was starting, because he was an old man by then, and was starting to get more conservative and less radical, and was saying, you know what, Hamas will recognize, we don't yet, but we will recognize Israel within 67 borders if in a final status negotiation for an independent Palestinian state. And you know what the Israelis did? They murdered him. They killed him with a missile strike. Why? For the same reason they helped create Hamas in the first place when Arafat was doing the same thing. Because they don't want a partner for peace. They'll kill a partner for peace. In fact, they poisoned Yasser Arafat to death too. Because they don't want someone who can convincingly say, we've got a deal. And in fact, I just posted this. You can find on my Twitter, although you have to go back a couple of weeks there. Or just search Scott Horton Show and Asset on Twitter, and you'll see the leader of the Religious Zionist Party, a former member of the Knesset, gives an interview to local Israeli TV, which was translated by an American Israeli friend of mine for me from Hebrew. And what he says is, he says, listen, the PA, that's Fatah, Yasser Arafat's old group, they're the liability. Hamas is an asset. And the news guy says, Hamas is an asset? And he says, yes, don't you see, in this great game of delegitimization that we are playing, in this great game of delegitimization that we are playing, Hamas can't go to the UN. Hamas can't go to the International Criminal Court. Hamas is on America's terrorist list. Hamas is essentially completely unqualified for participating in any global forum whatsoever. So we don't even need the Americans' veto on the UN Security Council as long as we can point to Hamas. Hamas is our strategic asset. The scarier they are with their balaclavas and their AK-47s marching around with their religious flags and all this kind of thing, the better it is for Israel. Because then they get to turn to you and say, oh, Tatiana, how are we supposed to negotiate with terrorists like this? Yeah, well, you killed Arafat and you killed Yassin, and now you got these guys, and so you say you can't deal with them. You know, but you see, it's the height of dishonesty. They don't want peace. They want that land.
So what can people do? This is a bummer. This conversation is like the endless torture of the Middle East that, we helped create. We've been talking
tell the
for a
truth.
while. What?
Read antiwar.com and stay up to date on it. And there's a movement now called boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which I'm totally against sanctions. You'd have to be a government to issue sanctions on someone. But boycott and divestment is great. Whatever Israeli brands that you know of or American companies that cooperate with Israel, especially in the occupied territories. There's been scandals about SodaStream and about Ben & Jerry's. This was a big one a couple weeks ago, that Ben & Jerry's have a big ice cream factory in the occupied West Bank on top of what used to be a Palestinian village. And so people, oh, you're so progressive, except for the Palestinians, huh, pal? And so people are going after Ben & Jerry's like that. So the boycott is a huge thing. And then any, large institutions that people are members of, you can divest and refuse to invest in companies that do business with Israel. Now, let's be very, very real about this. And clock's ticking here. I got to go in a sec. But there is no chance ever, okay, and no one is truly threatening, Tatiana, that the world is going to cut Israel off from investment capital and starve them out, okay? That's not what this is about. The Israelis have access to all the capital in the whole world that they need at any given time, and will always be able to take out loans from whatever banks anywhere else in the world, and they have plenty of their own money already. Hell, the U.S. gives them $4 billion a year every year, no matter what. But what it is, though, is it raises the question, why would anyone boycott Israel? I thought they were our friends, and the mean old Palestinians are occupying their territory and trying to kick all the Israeli Jews off of it. So why would you want to boycott Israel? And then the answer is, because you don't know the first thing about it. And it turns out that the Israelis are the aggressors and the Palestinians are their victims, and they deserve to be boycotted. And so it's essentially a conversation starter. And if it came to the point where you really had European states, the USA is a lost cause, but if you had major American corporations of some descriptions and you had even European states beginning to go along with this kind of program, and that's the kind of pressure that must be applied, that they, essentially the American government and the European governments help them get away with all of this. But for people who care not about the Palestinians, but about Israel and want Israel to last for the long term as a Jewish democracy with their super duper majority, what they're doing is wrong. They have to let the Palestinians go. And really this is the real answer now, because it's too late for that, is they need to have a single state. And they need to give, and look, I'm a no-state solution guy, but we're dealing with the world that we're living in now, all other things being equal, right? Ceteris paribus, equal rights a total separation of church and state in an Israeli democracy where everyone has equal citizenship and equal rights.
Thanks so much, Scott Horton. Everybody go to antiwar.com. Scott, where can people buy your books? Fool's Errand, enough already. Where can people buy all this stuff? Amazon, where's the best place to support you in the Libertarian Institute?
Sure. Just go to libertarianinstitute.org/books. We got all the books there, including the great Coming to Palestine by Sheldon Richman, which is absolutely all you need to know. I highly recommend that to you, Tatiana. And then you'll want to talk to Sheldon after you read it, too. He's so good, and the book is so good. And
excellent.
All that's there.
I'll be sure to do that. Thanks so much, Scott. We always love having you on the Tatiana Show. Everybody like this episode, share it with people, start a discussion. Peace out. Bye. Thanks. What's the point of all this technology without a little love in our lives? Our hosts, Tatiana Moroz and Lauren Kasovitz, have come together to bring you Proof of Love. Go to proofoflovecast.com. The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by CryptoMediaHub.com, a boutique marketing and PR agency for Bitcoin and beyond. Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. We gotta think and reflect and use lots of intellect with our hearts when we work together. I know that it can be so hard out there, looking all around and saying that life ain't fair. So that is why we will fight and stay up late at night, listening to the Tatiana Show. Thank you for listening to the Tatiana Show. Please follow us on Twitter at Queen Tatiana or on Facebook and Instagram at Tatiana Moroz Music. More episodes can be found at thetatianashow.com, and make sure you leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends. You are listening to the Tatiana Show. This show may contain adult content, language, and humor and is intended for mature audiences. If that's not you, please stop listening. Nothing you hear on the Tatiana Show is intended as financial advice, legal advice, or really anything other than entertainment. Take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Oh, and if you're listening to us on an affiliate network, the ideas and views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of the network that you're listening on or of any sponsors or any affiliate products you may hear about on this show.